What becomes of a mind so brilliant that even kings fear its wisdom, yet it bends in love before the crucified Christ? Welcome, dear listener, to Saint Lives. Wherever you rest, perhaps under quiet lamplight or drifting toward dreams, subscribe and join this gentle pilgrimage through faith, memory, and timeless grace. This is the life of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a young scholar whose radiant intellect defied emperors, whose faith converted hearts, and whose martyrdom transformed cruelty into glory, revealing that divine truth shines brightest when tested by the fires of suffering. In the golden age of Alexandria, where marble temples rose above the shimmering sea, and scholars from every corner of the empire gathered to seek wisdom, a child was born who would one day confound them all. Catherine entered the world not amid royal fanfare, but beneath the quiet glow of lamps burning before the household gods. Her birth unremarkable, except for the strange stillness that seemed to follow her first cry. The city around her was a place of restless brilliance, a meeting ground of languages, philosophies, and faiths, where even a child could breathe in the fragrance of ideas as easily as the scent of myrrh. It was said that from the earliest days, Catherine's eyes held an uncommon depth, as though she already saw beyond what others called real. Her tutors would one day whisper that she understood not only the meaning of words, but the silence between them. As she grew, the city became her classroom. She walked beneath the columns of the great library, gazing upon the carved faces of Athena and Hermes, hearing her teachers speak of logic, astronomy, and the motion of the stars. Every question delighted her. Every answer led to another question. When other children played in the courtyards, Catherine listened to the debates of the philosophers, absorbing their arguments like light through glass. Yet even as she mastered their teachings, she began to sense a hollowness within the wisdom of men. She saw how the same scholars who spoke of virtue would flatter kings, and how their gods seemed to mirror human failings, jealous, vengeful, capricious. Something in her heart longed for a truth untainted by pride, a love not bound by power. Her father, a nobleman of influence, took pride in her learning. He gathered the best tutors money could find, men who themselves had studied under the successors of the great philosophers. Catherine learned Greek, Latin, and even the mystical tongues of the East. She read poetry and law, studied geometry and medicine. Her mind moved with a precision that left her mentors speechless. But within the quiet chambers of her soul, another kind of study had begun, one that no teacher could measure. Sometimes she would sit beside the window, watching the harbor's slow rhythm, the sails dipping and rising like prayers upon the water, and she would whisper to herself, "If the world is so beautifully ordered, who is the one who orders it?" That question would follow her like a shadow. The more she sought wisdom in the words of men, the more she sensed that something essential was missing. It was as if she stood before an open door she could not yet see, her hand already reaching for the light beyond. People spoke of her as a marvel, a child blessed by the gods. But Catherine, in her solitude, felt only the ache of incompleteness. She wondered whether all her learning could ever reveal the meaning of goodness, or if truth itself must come not from thought, but from love. And so her life began as all pilgrimages do, not with a journey outward, but with a stirring within. In the restless beauty of Alexandria, where reason reigned and idols glimmered in the sun, a young girl was quietly being prepared for a destiny neither her tutors nor her parents could imagine. Somewhere deep within her heart, a seed of grace was waiting to bloom. And in the stillness of those early years, heaven was already watching. The years passed, and Catherine's mind unfolded like a bright scroll written by an unseen hand. She was no longer the curious child wandering marble halls, but a young woman whose intellect drew the admiration of scholars and the envy of men twice her age. The city of Alexandria, ever proud of its heritage of learning, began to speak her name in reverent tones, as though she were one of its treasures, a living embodiment of reason itself. She could quote the philosophers with effortless grace, dismantle complex arguments with clarity and composure, and yet she carried herself with a gentleness that made her brilliance seem almost tender. Those who came to test her mind often left wondering not only how she had outthought them, but how she had managed to make them feel at peace in their defeat. Yet for all her knowledge, Catherine's soul remained restless. The scrolls and the lectures no longer satisfied her heart, which had begun to thirst for something beyond logic, something eternal. The world she lived in was one of glittering contradictions. Alexandria was a city of statues and sanctuaries, of processions and sacrifices offered to gods, who neither spoke nor listened. Catherine would stand among the crowds as priests burned incense before the great idols, their smoke curling upward toward the indifferent sky, and she would feel a strange sadness. Was this all that the great human mind could offer? Rituals without meaning, beauty without truth? Her tutors spoke of the harmony of the cosmos, of virtue, of the pursuit of wisdom, yet none could tell her where wisdom led, or why the human heart longed for love that could not be contained by reason. And so Catherine withdrew from the feasts and public spectacles, spending long evenings alone among her books, searching for answers in the words of those who had come before. Plato spoke of an unseen good, a perfection toward which all things strive. Aristotle described an unmoved mover, pure intellect beyond change. These ideas thrilled her, for they seemed to point toward something greater than the marble gods of the temples. Yet even as she read, she sensed that the philosophers had glimpsed only a shadow of the truth. They had reasoned their way to the threshold of eternity, but none had crossed it. One evening, while walking through the colonnades that overlooked the sea, Catherine paused to watch the sunset. The sky burned in deep gold and crimson, the waves gleaming like molten glass. In that vast and glowing silence, she felt a yearning rise within her, so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. She whispered aloud, though no one stood beside her, "If you are there, the one who made this beauty, then show me yourself. Teach me not what truth is, but who truth is." The wind brushed her face like a benediction. The question hung in the air, unanswered yet alive. From that night onward, she began to sense that her search was no longer hers alone, that someone unseen had begun to search for her in return. In the days that followed, Catherine's reputation grew, but with it came a certain loneliness. Those who praised her learning could not understand the depth of her longing, and those who admired her beauty did not perceive the fire behind her eyes. Suitors came bearing gifts, noblemen offering marriage and power, but she refused them all with a calm dignity that astonished her family. "I am already promised," she once said quietly, though she could not yet name to whom. Her mother, worried by this strange devotion, sought the counsel of an old Christian hermit who lived beyond the city walls, a man known for his holiness and wisdom. Catherine agreed to visit him, more out of courtesy than curiosity. Yet what she found in that humble dwelling would alter the course of her life. The hermit was ancient and gentle, his eyes filled with the peace of one who had seen suffering yet not been broken by it. Around him hung the simple symbols of the faith, an icon of the Virgin, a wooden cross, a small oil lamp whose flame trembled like a living prayer. Catherine spoke to him of her studies, her questions, her belief that truth must exist but could not be found in the philosophies of men. The old man listened in silence, and when she finished, he said softly, "You seek the truth, my child, but truth is not an idea. Truth has a face, and his name is Jesus Christ." Catherine felt the words pierce her like light through crystal. She had read of gods and demiurges, of reason and the soul, but never had anyone spoken of truth as a person who could love, suffer, and be known. The hermit told her of the Son of God who had taken flesh, who had died on the cross out of love for mankind, and who now lived to offer eternal life. He spoke not with the eloquence of philosophers, but with the quiet certainty of one who had met what he described. Catherine listened, her heart pounding, every word awakening a sense of recognition, as though this was what she had always known but could never articulate. When he showed her an image of the Madonna and Child, she felt tears fill her eyes. The child's gaze, serene and yet infinitely sorrowful, seemed to meet her own. The hermit said, "He is the bridegroom of every soul that seeks truth. To those who love wisdom, he offers himself, for he is wisdom made flesh." Catherine left that place changed. She walked through the bustling streets of Alexandria as if in a dream, her mind alight with wonder. Could it be that the divine she sought all her life had already come into the world and offered himself as love? That night she could not sleep. She knelt by her window and prayed for the first time, awkwardly at first, then with growing fervor. "If you are the truth," she whispered, "then I am yours. Teach me to know you." In the stillness that followed, she felt a peace she had never known. It was not the satisfaction of intellect, but the quiet joy of surrender. Days later, she returned to the hermit, asking to be baptized. He taught her the creed, the words of the gospel, the mystery of the cross. He told her that wisdom begins where pride ends, that love is the final logic of the universe. When she stepped into the cool water, the sunlight streaming through the doorway, she felt as though the sea itself bowed before her new birth. Catherine the scholar had become Catherine the Christian. She returned home transformed, but not withdrawn. Her studies continued, yet now she saw every truth as a reflection of the divine word, through whom all things were made. Philosophy no longer seemed an end, but a pathway toward God. When she read the poets, she heard echoes of longing for the Creator. When she gazed upon the stars, she saw the handiwork of the one who had called her by name. Her heart was at peace, yet also burning, with a desire to share this revelation with others, to show that reason and faith were not rivals, but two wings lifting the soul toward the same sky. And though she did not yet know it, this harmony of mind and spirit would soon draw the attention of the most powerful man in the empire. But for now, she remained the quiet scholar of Alexandria, the young woman whose brilliance was matched only by her humility. The city moved on, oblivious to the divine storm gathering within its walls. Catherine often walked again by the sea, the wind carrying her prayers across the waters, and she would think of the words the hermit had spoken, that wisdom had a face, and that one day she would see it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, her destiny waited, already shining with the light of both triumph and sorrow. Days folded softly into years, and the young scholar's fame spread beyond Alexandria's golden gates. Catherine had become a name spoken in reverent tones, not merely for her intellect, but for the calm that seemed to accompany her every word. Even among the scholars of the great library, where wisdom itself was traded like gold, she was spoken of as a prodigy, a wonder whose mind belonged to another realm. Yet though her renown grew, her heart remained anchored in a different pursuit: the contemplation of God, the mystery of truth made flesh. She had come to understand that learning without love was a barren garden, and so she began to teach differently, gently leading her students not only to reason, but to reverence. Those who listened to her felt as though their souls had been washed clean of pride. Her faith did not silence her intellect. It gave it wings. And yet, beneath the serenity of her studies, the world outside trembled with unrest. The Roman Empire, vast and crumbling under the weight of its own splendor, had turned its suspicion toward the followers of Christ. Emperor Maxentius, seated upon his jeweled throne in Rome, had decreed that all must bow before the gods of the state, offering incense to the statues that lined the temples. Across the provinces, soldiers marched through streets demanding allegiance, and those who refused were branded enemies of the empire. Alexandria, proud jewel of learning, soon became a stage for fear and betrayal. The temples overflowed with smoke as sacrifices were offered to the false gods, and the cries of the faithful who refused mingled with the chants of the priests. Catherine watched from afar, her heart heavy. She saw men of wisdom, teachers, philosophers, even those who once debated with her, kneel before idols out of fear. The same lips that had once proclaimed virtue now trembled with cowardice. One morning, while the city gathered in the great square for a festival honoring the pagan gods, Catherine stood at her window and looked upon the spectacle. The emperor himself had arrived to oversee the sacrifice, his purple cloak trailing behind him like a shadow of power. Trumpets sounded, the crowd cheered, and animals were brought forth to be slain before the golden images of the gods. Catherine felt her soul stir with indignation. The air, thick with incense, seemed to choke her. How could those who claimed to love wisdom give their worship to lifeless stone? The whisper that had once called her to faith now spoke again within her. Go forth and speak. She tried to resist it. She was only one woman, unarmed, a believer in a forbidden faith. Yet the more she prayed, the clearer the voice became, not of command, but of love. You are not alone. I will give you words that no power can silence. That evening, Catherine gathered her courage and went to the palace. The guards, taken aback by the sight of a noble young woman demanding audience with the emperor, hesitated. But something in her bearing, so composed, so resolute, compelled them to let her through. She entered the grand hall, where Maxentius sat surrounded by his court, his face proud and hard. The hall glittered with wealth, gold lamps casting their glow upon mosaics of the gods. When Catherine approached, all fell silent. She bowed her head slightly in respect, then lifted her eyes and spoke with quiet strength. Emperor, she began, I have come not to rebel against your rule, but to question the truth upon which it stands. You command that all should worship your gods. But what power have they shown, save the power of men's hands that made them? A murmur swept through the hall. Maxentius narrowed his eyes. And who are you, he said, to question the faith of Rome? I am Catherine of Alexandria, she replied, her voice steady as water over stone. A daughter of your empire and a seeker of truth. I have studied the wisdom of the ancients, the logic of the Greeks, and the laws of Rome. But none of them hold the power of the Christ who died and rose again. You ask men to worship what cannot see or speak, yet the God I serve gives life, breath, and reason to all. Her words, clear and luminous, seemed to echo through the chamber. The courtiers whispered, scandalized and fascinated. The emperor, masking his anger with amusement, laughed aloud. If your Christ is as wise as you claim, then prove it, he said mockingly. I shall summon 50 of the greatest philosophers in the empire. If you can defeat them in debate, I will believe your God reigns above mine. Catherine bowed her head. Summon them, she said softly. It is not I who will speak, but the Spirit who dwells in me. The emperor waved her away, but his laughter faltered as she departed, for though she was but a girl, Her words carried a strange authority that unsettled him. The news spread quickly. In the days that followed, Alexandria buzzed with anticipation. The emperor's challenge had become a spectacle, a contest between human wisdom and divine faith. The scholars arrived from every province, old men draped in linen robes, their fingers stained with ink, their minds sharpened by years of study. They filled the marble hall where the debate would take place, carrying scrolls and arguments prepared to dismantle this Christian girl's faith. Yet when Catherine entered, they rose involuntarily, not in worship, but in the quiet acknowledgement of her dignity. She wore no jewels, no adornment, only a simple white robe, and her hair, unbound, fell like a dark veil across her shoulders. She carried herself not as a conqueror, but as a servant of truth. When the emperor took his seat, the debate began. One by one, the philosophers presented their arguments, eloquent, intricate, full of the brilliance of men who had spent lifetimes chasing the shape of truth through words. They spoke of matter and form, of divine essence and reason, of the eternity of the soul. Catherine listened patiently, her hands clasped, her eyes serene. When they had finished, she rose. Her voice, though gentle, carried through the hall with the clarity of a bell. "You have spoken wisely," she said, "but wisdom without light is blindness. You seek truth as if it were a riddle, but truth has walked among us, teaching, healing, dying for love of man. You reason about the divine, but I have seen his works. You analyze virtue, yet you have not met the one who is virtue itself." She quoted their own poets, their philosophers, weaving their words into a vision of the Logos made flesh. Every sentence seemed to lift their minds higher, turning their own arguments into stepping stones toward the very faith they had come to oppose. As she spoke, the atmosphere changed. The philosophers began to look upon her not with hostility but wonder. One by one, their questions faltered, their pride dissolved. The emperor's face darkened. He had expected to humiliate her, but instead he watched his finest scholars bow their heads. When Catherine finished, silence fell. Then the oldest of the philosophers stood and said, "We can no longer deny the truth. The God this woman serves is indeed the source of all wisdom." And before the throne of the emperor, they declared their faith in Christ. Fury consumed Maxentius. He ordered the philosophers burned alive, condemning them for their betrayal. Catherine wept for them, yet her tears were not of despair, but of awe, for she knew they had found in death the truth they had sought all their lives. As the flames rose, she prayed that their souls might find the peace that had once eluded their restless minds. That night, the city of Alexandria trembled with whispers. A young woman had faced the might of Rome and triumphed not through violence but through the luminous power of truth. The emperor could destroy her body, but he could not silence the truth she bore. And as the stars spread across the Egyptian sky, Catherine knelt once more by her window and whispered the same words she had spoken years before. "If you are the truth, I am yours." The answer, though still silent, burned in her heart like a promise. The following days settled over Alexandria with an uneasy stillness, as though the very air hesitated to move. The debate had ended, but its echo lingered like incense long after the candles had burned out. Those who had witnessed Catherine's triumph whispered her name with awe, while others spoke it with fear. The philosophers who had converted to the faith were dead, their ashes carried away by the wind, yet their courage spread like a living fire through the hearts of believers. The Christians of the city, once silent and hidden, began to lift their heads, emboldened by the vision of a young woman who had faced an emperor with nothing but faith and words. Catherine herself did not seek glory or applause. She retreated into prayer, her heart heavy with sorrow for the souls who had perished, her thoughts dwelling on the mystery of the cross. It was not victory she felt, but the stillness of a storm that had only just begun. Meanwhile, Emperor Maxentius could not sleep. The image of the girl who had shamed him before his court haunted him. Her words, calm, luminous, unflinching, had pierced something within him that no sword could reach. In his rage, he told himself that her power came from deceit, from the cunning of a sorceress, yet deep within, he felt the sting of her truth. Power, he realized bitterly, could command obedience, but not conviction. He had forced nations to kneel, but he could not compel the heart of one young woman to fear him. Pride, more than vengeance, drove him now. He summoned his advisers and demanded that Catherine be brought before him again, determined to break her will, not by argument this time, but by humiliation and pain. When the soldiers came to her home, Catherine was at prayer. She did not resist. She looked up at them with the same serenity that had unnerved the emperor, and simply said, "Lead me where God wills." They bound her hands, though she did not struggle, and led her through the streets. The people watched in silence. Some turned away, unwilling to see what courage looked like when it walked unarmed into the jaws of power. Others followed quietly, whispering prayers. At the palace gates, she was taken into a chamber draped in red and gold, where the emperor awaited her. Maxentius greeted her not with anger, but with false gentleness. He sought to charm her, believing he could win where threats had failed. "Catherine," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble, "you are young, beautiful, and wise. You could have anything, wealth, position, even a crown. Why destroy yourself for a God who cannot save you?" She looked at him, her gaze neither proud nor fearful. "The God I serve," she replied, "has already saved me. What you offer fades with time. What he gives endures forever." Her calm defiance made his temper flare, but he masked it with a smile. "If you will only renounce this faith," he continued, "I will make you my queen. You shall rule beside me, and your wisdom will guide an empire." Catherine's lips trembled, not with temptation, but pity. "You offer me a throne of dust," she said softly, "when I have already pledged myself to the King of Heaven." That moment, more than her arguments in the great debate, enraged him. He had seen men bow before him in terror, had watched warriors tremble at his gaze, but this young woman, fragile, bound, alone, stood as though crowned already. His voice hardened. "Then you will learn what becomes of those who defy Rome." He ordered her taken to the prison and left without food or comfort. Yet even in that darkness, Catherine found light. The cell, cold and bare, became a sanctuary. She prayed for the emperor, for the souls of those who served him, and for strength to endure whatever awaited her. In the silence, she felt no fear. Instead, she felt a strange joy, as though the chains around her wrists were threads binding her more closely to the one she loved. Days passed, and word of her imprisonment spread. Many came secretly to see her, drawn by curiosity or faith. Among them was the Empress herself, a woman of gentle heart who had long harbored doubts about the cruelty of her husband's reign. Disguised and escorted by a trusted servant, she entered the prison under cover of night. The flicker of a small oil lamp illuminated Catherine's face, pale but serene. The Empress knelt beside her, unable to hold back tears. "I have never seen such peace," she whispered. "How can you smile, knowing what awaits you?" Catherine took her hand gently. "Because my soul is free," she said. "They can bind my body, but they cannot chain the truth. My sufferings will be short, but my joy will be eternal." The empress bowed her head and asked to know more of this faith that could give courage in the face of death. Through the long hours of the night, Catherine spoke to her of Christ, the Lamb who suffered without hate, who turned the cross, a symbol of death, into the doorway to life. When the first light of dawn crept through the bars, the empress was no longer the same. She left the cell with tears of gratitude, her heart newly kindled with faith. The conversion of the empress soon reached the emperor's ears. His fury knew no limits. He could forgive rebellion, but not the quiet undermining of his pride by a woman's faith. He sent soldiers to the prison, ordering that Catherine be tortured until she renounced her God. They brought forth an instrument unlike any the city had seen before, a monstrous wheel fitted with blades, designed to tear flesh and bone apart as it spun. The crowd gathered once more in the great square, drawn by curiosity and dread. Catherine was led forth, her face calm, her hands clasped around the invisible cross of her heart. The emperor, seated upon his throne, looked upon her with cold triumph. "This," he declared, "is the price of defiance." The executioners bound her to the wheel, and the drums began to beat. The crowd fell silent. But as the mechanism turned, as the blades began to move, a sudden sound filled the air, like thunder tearing through the heavens. The wheel shattered. Its fragments flew outward, striking the soldiers who had prepared it. The people gasped, some falling to their knees, others fleeing in fear. Catherine stood untouched, her bindings falling from her like threads of smoke. The emperor rose, pale with rage and terror. "Witchcraft!" he shouted. But Catherine raised her voice above the clamor. "There is no magic here, only the power of the living God, whose strength is made perfect in weakness." That day, many who witnessed the miracle believed. The empress, now openly professing her faith, knelt before all and cried, "There is no God but the Christ of this woman." For this, Maxentius condemned her too, and she went to her death with a serenity that mirrored Catherine's own. The emperor, however, would not relent. Humiliated before his court, he commanded that Catherine be executed by the sword. In her final night upon the earth, she prayed again in the darkness of her cell, not for deliverance but for the souls of those who condemned her. The walls that confined her seemed to fade away, and she felt herself surrounded by light. Some said that angels visited her that night, bringing the fragrance of lilies. When dawn came, the soldiers found her kneeling, her face radiant as if she had seen the morning of another world. She rose without fear, blessing them as they led her to the place of execution. And as she walked, the people followed silently. No one shouted, no one jeered. The city that had once mocked the faith now seemed to hold its breath. When she reached the hill, she looked toward the rising sun and whispered a final prayer. "Receive my spirit, O Lord, and forgive those who know not what they do." The sword fell swiftly. Her blood touched the earth, and those who stood nearby swore they saw light pour from the wound like water. The body of Catherine was taken away by the angels, so the faithful later said, carried to the heights of Sinai, where her tomb would become a fountain of miracles. And though the emperor's power soon crumbled into dust, her name lived on, radiant as ever, a beacon for all who seek the harmony of wisdom and faith. In Alexandria, the wind still moves softly through the ruins, carrying her memory. The sea still shimmers with the same light she once watched as a child, the same light that called her beyond reason into love. And perhaps even now, when the night grows deep and still, one can almost hear the faint echo of her prayer upon the water, a reminder that truth, once found, can never die. The years that followed her death seemed to drift through time as softly as dust through sunlight, and yet her name, Her story and her spirit refused to fade. Catherine of Alexandria, once the solitary scholar who sought the light of truth amid the idols of empire, had entered into a different kind of immortality. The city that had witnessed her courage never forgot the day the wheel shattered at her touch. For many, it marked not an end, but a beginning. Her martyrdom became a quiet seed sown in hearts that had long been hardened by fear. Even among the soldiers who once served the emperor, whispers spread, how the girl had smiled as the sword fell, how the air had carried a scent like myrrh and roses, how her body had vanished before it could be defiled by the victors. Some said the angels had carried her to Sinai, where the desert winds would guard her rest. Others said her blood, spilled upon the stones, had consecrated the very earth of Alexandria, turning cruelty into sanctity. But all agreed that something beyond human understanding had taken place that day. It was as though heaven itself had stretched down to touch the cruelty of man and transform it into a testament of grace. At first, the empire sought to silence her memory. Decrees were issued forbidding the mention of her name, the telling of her story, the honoring of her faith. But the more they forbade her, the more her legend grew. In secret gatherings beneath the catacombs, the faithful whispered her prayers, lighting small lamps in her memory. Mothers told their children of the young woman who had faced an emperor with the strength of love alone. Teachers told their pupils that true wisdom is not born of pride, but of humility, and slowly, imperceptibly, the empire's own monuments began to crumble, while the invisible monument of Catherine's witness grew taller with each passing year. In time, pilgrims began to journey into the desert, following the stories of the angels who had borne her body away. They came across endless dunes, enduring the scorching sun and the cold of the nights, seeking the mountain where Moses had once heard the voice of God. There, among the rocks of Sinai, they found a spring of water that seemed to flow from nowhere, and its taste was sweet beyond telling. They built a small shrine beside it, believing it to be the resting place of St. Catherine. As the centuries unfolded, the shrine became a monastery, its walls rising like a fortress of prayer against the desolation of the desert. Monks from distant lands came to dwell there, dedicating their lives to contemplation, their chants echoing across the barren hills where silence itself seemed to kneel. The monastery of St. Catherine would become one of the oldest in the world, a sanctuary of faith and learning, where the wisdom of the saints and the treasures of Scripture were preserved even through the darkest of ages. Within those walls, her story was told again and again, not with triumphal pride, but with reverent wonder. The monks spoke of her not as a distant legend, but as a sister who walked beside them in their solitude. They said that in the stillness of night, when the desert wind moaned across the sand, her voice could sometimes be heard reciting the Psalms, as if she still prayed for the world she left behind. Her image appeared in paintings and mosaics, always serene, holding the wheel that had failed to destroy her and the palm branch of victory that could not be taken from her. Artists portrayed her with a crown, not of jewels, but of light, her gaze lifted toward heaven as though still in dialogue with the truth she had loved more than life itself. And as the centuries unfolded, her influence stretched far beyond the monastery that bore her name. In Europe, scholars and universities adopted her as their patroness. They saw in her not only the courage of a martyr, but the harmony of intellect and faith. A reminder that the pursuit of knowledge must never stray from the pursuit of goodness. To the young who studied under the flickering light of candles, she became a companion of the mind, a symbol that wisdom need not lead to pride, that reason itself can kneel before mystery without losing its dignity. Her feast day, celebrated each November, became a time when teachers and students laid aside their disputes and offered prayers for enlightenment. And even in the quiet corners of monasteries, her story continued to kindle the hearts of those who sought to unite contemplation with action, the light of the mind with the warmth of love. But her legacy was not only for the learned. In the humble villages of Christendom, her name was spoken with affection. Mothers taught their daughters her prayers, asking that they might inherit her purity and her strength. Blacksmiths forged the Catherine wheel, not as an instrument of pain, but as a symbol of divine triumph, its spokes spreading outward like rays of grace. Artists carved her likeness in wood and stone, placing her beside the Virgin Mary and Saint Margaret as one of the heavenly protectors of women. Sailors carried her image upon their ships, praying that the winds would favor them as they had once scattered the wheels of her tormentors. And across the vast lands of Europe, churches rose in her honor, some grand and gilded, others small and hidden, each one a voice in the unbroken hymn of remembrance that her life had begun. Through all these generations, the story of Saint Catherine remained more than history. It became a mirror held before every soul that sought to reconcile intellect and faith. For in her, reason was not abolished by belief, but fulfilled by it. She had climbed the heights of knowledge only to discover that true wisdom is found upon the cross. Her defiance of the emperor had not been rebellion, but fidelity, to a truth that no tyranny could command or corrupt. Her death, so cruel in its intention, had revealed that love endures even where flesh fails. In her, the Church found a symbol of the mind redeemed by grace, and her example became a quiet answer to the arrogance of every age that sought to exalt power over truth. As the centuries passed and empires fell, her monastery stood firm amid the shifting sands of history. Pilgrims continued to come, some seeking miracles of the body, others miracles of the soul. They knelt beside the stone where her relics were said to rest, their tears mingling with the dust, their hearts unburdened by the silent assurance that holiness is not the privilege of the strong, but the gift of the faithful. Many who came as doubters left as believers, their skepticism dissolved not by argument, but by the simple peace that seemed to dwell in that sacred place. And even now, in our own restless century, when the noise of the world seems to drown the voice of silence, her story speaks. It whispers that truth is not found in conquest, but in surrender, that the intellect without love becomes pride, and that even the smallest act of faith can withstand the might of an empire. In St. Catherine's life, we see not the tragedy of youth destroyed, but the transfiguration of youth fulfilled, a flame that burned so purely that death itself could not extinguish it. When pilgrims today climb the mountain of Sinai and stand beneath the stars that have watched over her for more than 1,000 years, they often say that the night there feels different, that the air carries a quiet holiness. Perhaps it is the echo of her prayer still moving through time, the same prayer she whispered as a girl beside the sea. If you are the truth, I am yours. And in that whisper, across the vast desert of the centuries, her voice still calls to every searching heart, to scholars, to believers, to wanderers and doubters alike, reminding them that the truest wisdom is not found in knowing, but in loving. There are stories in the history of the Church that glow quietly, not with the bright flare of conquest, but with the steady warmth of faith remembered. The story of St. Catherine did not vanish into the haze of legend. It continued to move like a current beneath the surface of time, unseen but persistent, shaping hearts that had never set foot in Alexandria, nor heard the language she spoke. Her name, whispered in prayer, began to cross mountains and oceans, carried by pilgrims who saw in her not only the courage of a martyr, but the gentle defiance of love. As the world changed, her image changed with it, yet the light remained the same. The philosophers of Greece had sought truth through logic. Catherine had found it through surrender. And centuries later, her spirit seemed to walk again through the corridors of every monastery, every classroom, every heart that yearned to reconcile the mind's restlessness with the soul's peace. In the Middle Ages, when faith and reason often wrestled like brothers beneath the same roof, Catherine became a bridge between them. The scholars of Paris and Oxford called her Philosophorum Domina, the Lady of Philosophers. They painted her in manuscripts beside Aristotle and Augustine, her calm face illumined by the golden halos of wisdom. She held the broken wheel, not as a token of pain, but as a sign of divine paradox, that what was meant for destruction had become a throne of triumph. The universities adopted her as their patroness, and on her feast day, students would gather to light candles and ask for her guidance. In the chill of November evenings, young scholars with ink-stained hands would whisper prayers for clarity of thought, not knowing that centuries earlier she too had knelt in lamplight, searching the same mysteries they now pursued. Her story taught them that intellect wasn't pride, but participation in the Creator's light. Knowledge, when rightly ordered, was a hymn, and study itself could become a form of prayer. Across the lands of Christendom, her devotion grew in quiet constellations. In France, cathedrals raised towers in her name. In England, her likeness was carved above church doors, gazing eternally upon those who entered to pray. In Italy, artists found in her beauty a reflection of divine harmony. Her features serene, her expression tinged with sorrow and serenity intertwined. Painters like Raphael and Caravaggio gave her the radiance of one who sees eternity through the veil of suffering. She became one of the virgin martyrs, most beloved in Christian devotion, alongside Agnes, Cecilia, and Lucy. Yet her story carried a special tenderness, for she was both the daughter of philosophy and the bride of faith. Her martyrdom was not only the victory of purity, but the triumph of intellect redeemed. Through these centuries, a curious phenomenon occurred. Wherever her story was told, learning seemed to take root beside faith. Monasteries founded schools under her patronage. Scribes copied her life in illuminated manuscripts whose margins blossomed with wheels, stars, and lilies, the symbols of her purity and endurance. Students invoked her before examinations, asking that their minds might serve truth, not vanity. In this way, Catherine's spirit wove itself into the very rhythm of Christian education. She had once faced 50 philosophers and turned their logic into praise. Now she guided countless others to see that reason, when lifted by grace, leads not to arrogance, but to awe. But her influence reached beyond books and cloisters. Among the poor and the humble, her name became a household prayer. Women invoked her protection in childbirth. Travelers prayed to her on long journeys. The sick sought her intercession when suffering grew unbearable. The wheel, once an emblem of pain, appeared on jewelry, banners, and the stained glass of chapels, reminding believers that what is meant to destroy can, by faith, be transformed into glory. In medieval towns, processions on her feast day wound through narrow streets, the faithful carrying candles that flickered like stars in the winter dusk. Hymns rose into the evening air, their verses retelling her courage in simple, tender words. And in each voice that sang her name, there was an echo of that ancient hall in Alexandria, where she had stood alone against the emperor, an echo that still refused to fade. Legends began to adorn her memory, woven from faith's imagination. It was said that before her death, Christ himself appeared to her in a vision, placing a golden ring upon her finger, sealing her as his bride. The ring, unseen by mortal eyes, became a symbol of her mystical union with the divine Word. Artists later painted her with this celestial jewel, its light soft upon her hand, as if to remind all who beheld her that the ultimate truth is not known through reason alone, but through love. Others claimed that when her body was carried by angels to Mount Sinai, the mountain itself bloomed in midwinter, its stones turning red where her blood had fallen. Such tales, born of reverence rather than history, did not distort her story. They deepened it, allowing the faithful to glimpse the invisible truths her life revealed, that sanctity transforms the natural world, that beauty springs from sacrifice, that love is stronger than the sword. And though empires rose and fell, the devotion to Saint Catherine endured. Even during the ages when faith dimmed and the world grew skeptical, her figure remained, serene amid the ruins of certainties. To those who doubted, she offered the quiet assurance that truth is not an opinion, but a presence. To those who despaired, she stood as proof that the human soul, when surrendered to grace, can resist any tyranny. Her story transcended religion, touching poets and thinkers who sensed in her the image of integrity unbroken. The wheel upon which she triumphed became a symbol in art and literature, representing the cycle of life, suffering, and renewal. Even in lands far from Christianity, her name carried a sense of wonder, as though humanity itself recognized in her a reflection of its highest longing, the longing to remain faithful to truth, even unto death. In the Eastern Church, her feast remained among the most honored, celebrated with incense and chant in monasteries that echoed with the same prayers she once spoke. Pilgrims continued to climb Sinai to venerate her relics, finding there a peace that no empire could destroy. In the West, her image graced the walls of countless churches, a silent teacher to generations who might never hold a book, but could still learn the wisdom of her example. The candlelight that flickered before her icons seemed to dance in rhythm with her story, its flame fragile yet unconquered, as if even the smallest light, once kindled in love, could illuminate the darkness of centuries. As time carried her memory forward, the world she had known faded into legend, but her message remained as urgent as ever. Every age has its idols, its emperors of pride, its wheels of cruelty, its illusions of wisdom without love. And in every age, Catherine's voice seems to rise anew, soft yet unwavering, reminding humanity that knowledge divorced from compassion becomes barren, that truth without humility becomes violence. Her life, though framed in the marble of antiquity, continues to breathe through the centuries as an answer to the question that once stirred her heart by the sea. Who is the truth? When pilgrims today light candles before her image, they are not only remembering a saint, they are entering into the same conversation she began long ago. Her wheel still turns, not as a tool of torment, but as a circle of grace, a reminder that faith and reason revolve together around the same divine center. And her story, like the steady hum of a distant hymn, continues to speak to those who seek God not in triumph, but in understanding. For Catherine of Alexandria, the teenage genius who faced an empire, remains forever the saint of those who think deeply and love even deeper. The saint who taught the world that the greatest wisdom is found not in knowing everything, but in offering everything to the one who knows. The centuries rolled onward, carrying the name of Catherine through the corridors of faith and into the wider expanse of time. Her story, once confined to the marble halls of Alexandria and the sands of Sinai, now echoed through cloisters, chapels, and libraries across continents. Wherever her image appeared, whether carved in ivory or painted upon the glowing surface of stained glass, it seemed to breathe a quiet intelligence, a serene defiance that transcended the brutality of her martyrdom. In the medieval imagination, she had become not merely a saint, but a kind of celestial scholar, a figure whose beauty, purity, and intellect reflected the harmony of heaven itself. And yet, beneath the layers of reverence, her story remained profoundly human. For at its heart lay a truth that every soul, no matter its age or century, must encounter, that the pursuit of wisdom finds its end not in understanding, but in love, and that love, once awakened, asks everything in return. By the 13th century, her devotion had spread so widely that her feast day was among the most celebrated in Christendom. Bells rang across cities at dawn on the 25th of November, calling the faithful to Mass. The air smelled of incense and cold stone, the hymns rising like silver smoke into vaulted ceilings. Students in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford kept vigil through the night before her feast, reciting psalms and reading aloud her story by candlelight. They called themselves Catherine's scholars, and in their devotion to study they sought to imitate not her brilliance alone, but her humility. In a world that often prized cleverness more than compassion, she stood as a reminder that knowledge without virtue leads the soul astray. The monks who copied her life into illuminated manuscripts adorned her pages with golden stars and roses, as though each letter were itself an offering of gratitude. Her name became a bridge between prayer and intellect, faith and reason, a bridge that countless generations would cross. In England, she became a symbol of purity and steadfastness. Churches dedicated to her appeared in villages and cities alike. The Great Wheel, once an emblem of horror, was now carved above doorways as a sign of protection. In France, processions wound through the streets on her feast day, children carrying small wooden wheels bound with ribbons of gold and blue. They sang songs of her courage, their young voices rising into the cold air, echoing the strength of the young saint who had defied an emperor. In Italy, her image found its way into art with such tenderness that even those who did not know her story felt moved to reverence. Painters captured her at the moment before her death, her eyes lifted heavenward, her face illuminated not by fear, but by joy. Her martyrdom was not depicted as tragedy, but as transfiguration, a soul passing through suffering into light. The devotion to Saint Catherine also found a place within the life of mystics and contemplatives. In the silence of monasteries, her story became a mirror for those who longed for union with God through prayer. Among them was another Catherine, centuries later, in the city of Siena, a woman who would also challenge kings and heal the wounds of the Church. The younger Catherine looked to her Alexandrian namesake as a guiding star, seeing in her the perfect blending of intellect and holiness. To these mystics, the first Catherine represented not only courage, but contemplation, an interior wisdom born from love's stillness. They believed that her soul, now radiant in eternity, continued to intercede for those who sought understanding in the midst of darkness. And so, her name became not only a prayer upon the lips of scholars, but a whisper in the hearts of saints. Legends continued to grow around her, shaped by centuries of faith. Pilgrims who journeyed to Mount Sinai told of miracles at her shrine, the blind receiving sight, the barren conceiving children, the lost finding peace. The monastery that bore her name became a fortress of the spirit amid the endless desert. Its walls, sun-worn and austere, enclosed a garden where olive trees grew beside ancient wells. Within its chapel, Monks kept watch by the flickering light of lamps said to burn with oil from her own relics. Pilgrims would kneel before the golden reliquary said to hold her hand, marveling at the faint fragrance of lilies that seemed to fill the air. When the sun rose over Sinai, casting long shadows across the stones, the mountains glowed red with the same color that legend claimed had stained them with her blood. For those who climbed that sacred height, it was as though the silence itself bore witness to her. The Church, in her wisdom, preserved Catherine's story not merely as pious legend, but as living theology. She was declared one of the 14 holy helpers, saints invoked in times of suffering and danger. Her name was spoken beside those of Margaret, Barbara, and George, warriors of the soul who had faced their trials with faith. But Catherine's power was of a different kind. She conquered not by the sword, but by the word. Her eloquence, her courage, her gentleness, all bore witness to the truth that holiness doesn't shout, it persuades. Through her, the Church taught that the human mind, when illumined by grace, becomes a vessel of divine wisdom. And so she became a patron not only of philosophers, but of all who seek light in a world shadowed by ignorance and pride. As the Renaissance dawned, her image appeared anew. Artists, poets, and thinkers saw in her story the perfect marriage of intellect and sanctity. In Florence, Botticelli painted her with the soft radiance of a dawn sky, her broken wheel resting at her feet like a conquered beast. In Venice, Bellini portrayed her with a quiet dignity, her eyes reflecting the serenity of those who know that truth cannot die. Even as Europe shifted from the age of faith to the age of reason, Catherine remained a bridge between the two. She embodied what the Renaissance itself longed for, the belief that beauty, knowledge, and holiness are not separate paths, but converging rivers leading to the same divine sea. And yet, as centuries passed, the world grew louder and more skeptical. The idols of old, of stone and gold, were replaced by subtler idols, human pride, intellect divorced from reverence, power divorced from mercy. In such an age, the voice of Catherine seemed at once distant and desperately needed. Her story whispered from the quiet corners of churches, from the lips of old nuns teaching their students, from the pages of forgotten missals. She reminded each generation that truth is not conquered by argument, nor holiness by force. She reminded them that purity of heart is stronger than armies, and that faith, though mocked by empires, is never truly defeated. Her wheel turned on through time, a circle of meaning that renewed itself with every soul who discovered her anew. Perhaps that is why, even today, her image can still be found, faded but persistent, in the corners of ancient sanctuaries, her eyes forever lifted toward the invisible. For St. Catherine's story was never about a single act of martyrdom, nor a single moment of courage. It was about the lifelong pilgrimage of a soul that sought truth with all its strength, found it in the face of Christ, and refused to let go, even when the world demanded her silence. The world still searches for what she found. And sometimes, in the quiet between thought and prayer, it seems almost possible to hear her voice again, the same voice that once silenced emperors, speaking to every restless heart. Seek wisdom, but let love be its end. Seek truth, but let humility be its path. For no mind is truly wise until it kneels before the mystery of God. Across the unending stretch of centuries, the world continued to change, but the quiet radiance of St. Catherine did not dim. Her wheel kept turning through time, not as an instrument of torment, but as a symbol of the soul's unbroken circle, a sign that what is pure cannot be undone by violence, that truth, once awakened, cannot be silenced. Even as kingdoms rose and crumbled, as the world's philosophies shifted and faith itself was tested by doubt, her story endured like a lamp burning in the farthest corner of memory. To those who still believed that reason and love could dwell together, she became a companion of the Spirit. Her presence felt more as a whisper than a proclamation, more as a melody than a monument. The age of monasteries gave way to the age of cities, libraries filled with new voices, and the hum of discovery filled the air of Europe. Men looked again to the heavens, measuring the paths of stars that Catherine had once contemplated as signs of divine order. The scholars who studied the laws of motion and the structure of the cosmos, though far removed from the simplicity of faith, still walked, whether they knew it or not, along a road she had helped to clear. For she had shown that truth, even when sought by the intellect, belongs ultimately to the soul. It was she who first bridged the gulf between the philosopher and the believer, between logic and love, showing that the mind can kneel without surrendering its dignity. The universities that carried her name, Cambridge, Paris, Oxford, and others scattered across Europe, stood as quiet witnesses to her legacy. Within their chapels, students knelt before her image before taking up their books, whispering for her intercession, not to make them clever, but to make them wise. Yet the march of time brought new tempests. Wars and reformations tore through Christendom, and many saints were cast aside as relics of superstition. Images were broken, relics scattered, churches burned or emptied. The old rhythm of devotion faltered under the weight of argument and division. Still, even in that upheaval, her story survived. Among the ruins of old altars, her name continued to appear in prayer books and on the lips of the faithful. Soldiers carried medallions of her into battle, women whispered her prayer in childbirth, and scholars, even in secret, invoked her before their studies. The monasteries that survived still preserved her relics and her story, and in the deserts of Sinai, the monks of her mountain kept the lamps burning as they had since the dawn of faith. It was during these turbulent centuries that a new kind of devotion to Catherine began to grow, one not confined to ritual, but woven into the quiet interior life of the soul. She was remembered not merely as the scholar who debated philosophers, or the martyr who defied an emperor, but as the friend of all who wrestled with doubt and silence. Artists and poets of the later centuries painted her not in triumph, but in contemplation, her head slightly bowed, the broken wheel beside her not as a trophy, but as a memory of the cost of love. Her eyes, in those paintings, seemed to gaze beyond the frame, as though seeing what no artist could capture, the eternal truth that dwells beyond suffering. To look upon her face was to be reminded that wisdom is not found in conquest, but in surrender. As Europe entered its age of reason, the world grew louder with knowledge but quieter in faith. The old saints, who once spoke through miracle and mystery, seemed to retreat into silence. Yet the silence was not absence, it was endurance. In that new age of skepticism, Catherine's story began to take on a subtler form. Philosophers, even those who had turned away from the church, found themselves drawn to her example. They admired her courage, her commitment to truth even in the face of death, her ability to marry intellect and conviction. In her, they saw what they had long forgotten. That reason without compassion becomes cruelty, and that belief without thought becomes blindness. And so, in the very age that sought to move beyond faith, St. Catherine remained relevant, as though she were smiling gently at humanity's endless attempt to rediscover what she had already known. That truth and love are not two paths, but one. In the east, where her monastery stood beneath the shadow of Mount Sinai, the memory of her miracles endured. Pilgrims continued to cross the deserts, their journeys long and perilous, Some came seeking healing, others came seeking peace. The monks who greeted them offered bread, water, and silence. Within the monastery walls, time seemed to move differently. The relics of the saint, guarded for more than 1,000 years, remained untouched by corruption. The air inside the chapel smelled faintly of oil and stone, the same scent that had filled the halls since the early days of the faith. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, its vast emptiness a reminder of how small the world's empires truly were. For here, in this place of solitude, the faith of one woman had outlasted the might of Rome. Travelers who visited the monastery in later centuries spoke of the peace they felt there. Some were believers, others skeptics. Yet all described the same sensation, a sense of stillness that was not emptiness but fullness, as though the silence itself prayed. One pilgrim wrote that at sunrise, the light touched the stones of Sinai with a blush of rose, and for a moment he felt as if the mountain itself were alive, still remembering the feet of the angels who had once carried Catherine's body to rest. In the evenings, when the monks sang their prayers, their voices echoed softly off the rocks, mingling with the wind that swept through the valleys. The hymn they sang had been sung for centuries. Holy Saint Catherine, wise Virgin of the Lord, guide us through the desert of our minds into the light of truth. In every age, her story returned to those who needed it most. During the plagues that swept through Europe, when scholars and peasants alike were struck by the same invisible hand of death, her name was invoked as protector and comforter. Her steadfastness in suffering became an image of endurance, her calm before the emperor a mirror for those who faced their own trials with fear. When parents buried their children, when scholars saw their libraries burn, when nuns tended the sick and dying, they whispered her name, trusting that she who had once faced the wheel would intercede for them in their own agony. Her story gave meaning to pain, not by explaining it away, but by transforming it into prayer. And so, her legacy wove itself quietly into the fabric of faith, like golden thread in a tapestry of centuries. Her presence could be felt wherever wisdom was sought humbly, wherever courage rose in the face of cruelty, wherever the soul dared to believe that truth and love are worth dying for. Even now, long after the empire that condemned her has turned to dust, Saint Catherine of Alexandria stands as one of those few eternal voices that continue to speak to both heart and mind. She speaks softly, as she always has, not from the heights of power, but from the depths of contemplation. Her wheel still turns, not upon the earth, but within the human spirit, reminding us that the cycle of suffering and grace is never ending, and that faith, once born in a single soul, can outlast empires, philosophies, and even time itself. For though her body rests upon the mountain, her spirit still walks beside every seeker who stands before the mystery of truth and wonders, as she once did, whether reason alone can bear the weight of eternity. And somewhere, in that silent space between thought and faith, her voice still answers, "Seek, but do not forget to love. For love is the final wisdom, and the only truth that doesn't die." In every generation, new hearts have risen to rediscover Saint Catherine, though they did not always know her name when they first began to seek what she embodied. For the world never ceases its restless pursuit of meaning. Even when it forgets the language of faith, it still hungers for truth, still aches for beauty that does not fade. And so, through the long corridors of time, her memory continued to whisper. She was not a figure who demanded devotion through fear or miracle, but one who invited reflection, one who reminded each searching soul that the highest wisdom is never divorced from humility, that love alone gives reason its purpose, Across the ages, her image changed, but the light behind it never did. To some, she appeared as the scholar crowned with stars. To others, the martyr serene upon her wheel. But beneath these forms lived the same unshakable peace, the same quiet certainty that truth is not a prize to be claimed, but a presence to be adored. As Europe moved toward the dawn of modernity, her influence rippled through the hearts of poets and visionaries, artists who felt the tension between faith and reason more keenly than ever. Catherine came to symbolize the harmony they sought, a wisdom that embraced mystery rather than dissolving it. Writers described her as a bridge between the old world and the new, the mind that understood both philosophy and prayer, the saint who refused to separate intellect from wonder. Even as the Church faced new challenges and the rise of skepticism, she stood as a silent refutation of despair. Her story was retold not with the thunder of dogma, but with the gentleness of example, a living proof that holiness could be both radiant and rational, both beautiful and true. Among the faithful, devotion to her continued to flourish quietly. Her relics remained a destination for pilgrims who traveled to Mount Sinai, sometimes in secret, sometimes in public joy. They came from distant lands, priests, students, mothers, and wanderers, each carrying the unspoken hope that her intercession might lead them closer to the peace she had found. Those who reached the monastery spoke of a stillness unlike any other, a silence that felt alive, as though the desert itself prayed with them. The monks there, custodians of her memory, told stories of pilgrims healed of despair rather than illness, of souls unburdened more than bodies restored. For Catherine's miracles were of the spirit. Her power lay not in the spectacle of healing, but in the quiet conversion of the heart. In the world beyond, her name became woven into the daily rhythm of life. Guilds of craftsmen and scholars adopted her as their patroness. The wheel, once a sign of cruelty, now adorned coats of arms, coins, and manuscripts, its spokes radiating like beams of sunlight. On her feast day, bells would ring in towns across Europe, calling people to pause, to remember the young woman who had given her life for truth. In some villages, wheels of bread were baked and shared among the poor, a gesture of gratitude for the saint who had turned suffering into nourishment for the soul. Even as the centuries passed and new saints arose, Catherine's feast retained its unique gentleness, a day when the Church seemed to breathe more slowly, to remember that holiness need not always roar. It can also whisper, teach, and wait. Artists of the Baroque and Renaissance eras continued to find in her an inexhaustible muse. They painted her at the moment of revelation, her eyes lifted toward heaven, her hand resting upon the broken wheel. In their brush strokes, the contrast between fragility and strength came alive. Her beauty was not of ornament, but of order, the symmetry of a soul fully given to God. The light that touched her face in those paintings was never harsh. It was the same quiet illumination that once filled the chamber where she stood before the emperor. Sculptors carved her in marble, her countenance both serene and sorrowful, as though forever standing between the wisdom of heaven and the wounds of earth. Each representation became less about the historical woman and more about what she represented: the human intellect purified by faith, the heart refined through sacrifice. Yet even as her image adorned churches and palaces, the world outside began to drift into new forms of darkness. The revolutions of thought and industry that reshaped Europe also reshaped the human spirit. The age of machines and reason promised liberation from superstition, but often it brought loneliness instead. In cities filled with noise, the soul's silence became a rare and precious thing. It was during these restless centuries that Catherine's story quietly began to speak again, this time to those who felt lost amid progress. Her tale reminded them that the dignity of the human person does not lie in power or invention, but in the willingness to love truth even when it costs everything. And though few would call upon her by name, the very questions she once asked, about meaning, justice, and divine beauty, continued to haunt the hearts of thinkers and dreamers alike. In some ways, her influence became hidden, absorbed into the fabric of culture itself. The idea that wisdom must be guided by virtue, that intellect must serve compassion, that truth must be sought in humility. All these principles, once embodied in her life, became part of the moral vocabulary of the Christian world. Even those who no longer knelt in prayer still carried her echo within their conscience. And in monasteries and convents, far from the clamor of cities, her name continued to be spoken. Nuns teaching in small schools across Europe would tell her story to children gathered around flickering hearths. They spoke not of her martyrdom first, but of her questions, the curiosity that drove her to seek God through the study of the world. To those children she became a companion of wonder, proof that learning itself could be a form of praise. And as new lands were discovered across oceans, missionaries carried her image with them. Her name crossed mountains and seas, carved into wooden chapels, and whispered in strange tongues. In faraway lands where the Christian faith was newly sown, she became a symbol of courage for converts who faced their own emperors, their own wheels. Her story transcended borders because it spoke a universal truth, that love of God and love of truth are one and the same flame. Whether in the deserts of Sinai or the jungles of Asia, her light found its way into hearts that might never have heard of Alexandria or Maxentius, but understood what it meant to stand for something unseen. By the time the modern age dawned, St. Catherine had become a figure both ancient and eternal, a saint of every century. Her feast continued to mark the calendar even as the world seemed to move faster than ever before. And still, each year, in churches both grand and humble, her hymn was sung. O Holy Catherine, wise and pure, teach us to seek wisdom that endures. In that moment, the centuries seemed to fold together. The scholars of the Middle Ages, the monks of Sinai, the children of village schools, all gathered in spirit beneath the same quiet sky of faith. Her wheel, her crown, her palm, all symbols of her life, remain not as relics of a lost devotion, but as emblems of something eternal. The wheel reminds us that suffering can be transformed, that pain can become praise. The crown recalls that humility, not pride, is the mark of true greatness. The palm, tender and green, speaks of the victory of love over fear. Together they form the story of a woman who never sought glory, but found it, who never sought immortality, but was given it, who never sought power, but whose faith has outlasted empires. And so her story continues, woven through time like a golden thread that refuses to break. For every soul that has ever wondered whether truth is worth suffering for, Catherine's life stands as an answer. The young girl who once stood before the emperor with nothing but faith and words still stands before us all, her voice unbroken, her gaze undimmed. She reminds us that wisdom without love is hollow, and that the human heart, once illuminated by grace, becomes a light that no shadow can extinguish. There is something almost eternal in the way certain lives refuse to fade, how they seem to breathe long after the dust of centuries has settled. St. Catherine of Alexandria belongs to this rare company, her story alive not merely because it was written in books, but because it was etched into the imagination of faith itself. Her voice, though silent, has never stopped speaking. Her courage, though long past, has never ceased to inspire. And somewhere in the slow turning of time, she became not just a saint of memory, but a symbol of what it means to stand unbroken in a world that trembles. Through every age, through each generation's search for meaning, she continues to live. In the mind that seeks wisdom, in the heart that endures trial, in the soul that chooses love over fear. When the modern world finally began to see itself as separate from the sacred, when the rhythm of prayer gave way to the rhythm of machines, many feared that the old saints would fade, their stories too gentle, too distant for a world that prized speed and proof. Yet Catherine's story endured precisely because it spoke to something that progress could not replace. The scholar of Alexandria, who dared to question the gods of her age, remained a mirror for every age that would follow. Her defiance of falsehood was not rebellion for its own sake. It was the soul's instinct to seek light. And as the world grew noisier, more skeptical, and yet more lonely, her image began to appear again, quietly but persistently, in those who searched for meaning amid the hum of modern life. Artists and writers of the 19th century rediscovered her, not as a medieval relic, but as a timeless archetype. Painters depicted her not in palaces or among philosophers, but standing alone beneath the desert sky, her wheel shattered beside her, her eyes turned toward a dawn that the world could not see. Poets wrote of her as the woman of the mind's night, the seeker whose faith made thought itself holy. To them, Catherine represented the reconciliation the human spirit craves, the joining of intellect and devotion, of understanding and surrender. She was the answer to the modern heart's dilemma: how to think deeply without losing the capacity to believe, how to question without ceasing to love. Her presence was felt, too, in quieter ways. The old monasteries that bore her name continued their ancient rhythm of prayer, their chants rising each morning from the sands of Sinai as they had for over 1,000 years. Pilgrims still arrived from every corner of the earth. Scientists, soldiers, mothers, and monks, all drawn by a longing that words could not satisfy. They climbed the rugged slopes of Mount Sinai, where the wind seemed to carry the murmur of eternity. And there, before the reliquary that held what was believed to be her bones, they knelt in silence. Some prayed for healing, others for wisdom, others simply for peace. Many left without knowing what had changed within them, only that something in the stillness had answered the noise of their lives. It was said that even in those modern centuries, miracles continued to occur, not of spectacle, but of quiet transformation. A young teacher who had lost faith in her calling left the mountain with a heart renewed for her students. A scientist who had dismissed the idea of God returned home with tears in his eyes, whispering that truth was larger than he had imagined. Pilgrims wrote of a peace so deep it could not be spoken, as though Catherine's prayer still hung in the desert air, calling each soul to its own awakening. And perhaps that is the miracle that matters most, the gentle return of the heart to its center, the rediscovery of stillness in a world of motion. In the church, her feast continued to mark the year like a star that refuses to dim. Each November 25th, the liturgy spoke again the ancient words that had been prayed over her memory for more than a millennium. The readings told of wisdom and courage, the hymns of purity and light. And in monasteries and convents, in schools and universities, her name was spoken with gratitude. Students of theology, philosophy, and the sciences invoked her as their patroness, asking that their learning might never lead them away from truth. Teachers prayed for her intercession that they might awaken not only minds but hearts. Her story reminded them all that knowledge without love becomes tyranny, that wisdom without humility becomes emptiness. In this way, she remained a quiet presence in the life of the Church, a steady, unchanging rhythm beneath the noise of time. Even those who did not believe found themselves moved by her story. Historians, skeptical of miracles, still admired her courage. Feminists of later generations, seeking examples of women who had defied the constraints of their age, found in her a figure both intellectual and heroic, a woman who used her mind not for ambition, but for the service of truth. Artists saw in her martyrdom not defeat, but transcendence, the moment when mortal fragility reveals divine strength. And ordinary people, weary of the cruelty of the world, saw in her a face that promised peace, the kind of peace that no power can purchase and no empire can destroy. Through it all, her wheel continued to turn through the centuries, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, yet always moving. It turned in the thoughts of the philosopher who prayed before writing, in the heart of the mother who suffered in silence, in the endurance of every soul that refused to surrender to despair. Her story became less about history and more about the eternal rhythm of faith, the call to stand, to speak, to love, even when the world mocks or misunderstands. Catherine had once faced an emperor who demanded her silence, but her voice only grew stronger after death. And so it is with truth itself. Crushed again and again, yet always rising, luminous, unbroken. As the modern world entered the age of disbelief, Catherine's image lingered in the quiet corners of faith. In the flickering light of votive candles, her figure could still be seen, painted upon the walls of old churches, her face calm and kind, her eyes alive with that same steady flame of understanding. The people who prayed before her were no longer philosophers or monarchs. They were the poor, the weary, the unnoticed, and yet to each of them she offered the same invitation she had once given to the emperor, to seek a truth that cannot be commanded or controlled, to surrender to a wisdom greater than power. And perhaps it is there, in that humility, that her story finds its truest meaning. Catherine's greatness was not in her intellect, though it was unmatched, nor in her courage, though it was beyond measure. Her greatness lay in her surrender, in her willingness to let wisdom become love, to let reason kneel before the mystery of God. She reminds us that the truest learning ends not in pride, but in prayer, that the highest logic is the logic of the cross. To the world, her death was tragedy. To heaven, it was consummation, the completion of a life lived entirely for truth. Even now, in a world illuminated by screens instead of candles, her light still burns. Her story speaks softly to those who cannot find peace in progress alone, who feel that something essential has been forgotten. She whispers across the centuries that faith and thought, heart and mind, must walk together if humanity is ever to be whole. And somewhere, beneath all the noise, her words still echo as they once did before an emperor's court. There is a wisdom greater than power, a love stronger than fear, and a truth that no darkness can destroy. The world into which St. Catherine's name continues to drift is one far removed from the marble streets of Alexandria, and yet her voice still fits it perfectly. For though ages have passed, and the empire that condemned her lies buried in the dust, humanity has not changed so greatly as it imagines. The same hunger for meaning still stirs beneath the glitter of progress, the same longing for truth, for love, for something that cannot be measured or consumed. In every century, the idols alter their shapes, but not their essence, and the challenge remains the same. Whether the heart will serve what is passing or what is eternal. Catherine's story endures because it answers that question not with a philosophy, but with a life given freely, without hesitation, in fidelity to a truth that outlasts the world. As the modern age deepened in its complexities, her example seemed at once remote and strangely relevant. The image of a young woman facing an emperor might have belonged to ancient legend, but the courage it portrayed was timeless. For though the wheel and the sword no longer waited in the public square, the struggle between truth and falsehood, conscience and convenience, continued in quieter ways. The tyranny of one man had been replaced by subtler tyrannies, of ambition, of fear, of the restless desire to belong to a world that rewards compromise. And in such an age, Catherine's defiance shone all the more brightly. She had not chosen martyrdom out of rebellion, but out of fidelity. She stood before power not to destroy it, but to remind it of the higher order to which all power must answer. That reminder has never lost its urgency. In the years following revolutions and wars, when Europe's cathedrals lay broken and faith itself seemed fragile, her name still appeared in the prayers of those who refused to despair. Her story was told again by candlelight in ruins, where once choirs had sung. She became for many not just the saint of scholars, but the saint of survival, proof that truth, though wounded, cannot die. Soldiers carried her medals into battle. Prisoners carved her wheel into the walls of their cells. Her face appeared on small prayer cards passed secretly among believers when the open practice of faith was forbidden. She had once faced the wrath of an emperor, and now she walked invisibly among those who faced regimes no less cruel, lending them her calm, lending them her courage. It was said that to pray to St. Catherine was to remember that conscience is worth any cost, but her presence was not confined to suffering. In classrooms and quiet convent schools, her spirit lived on in the patience of teachers who saw in their work the same vocation that had defined her life, to make the mind a gateway for grace. Her image hung in libraries beside crucifixes and maps of the world, her calm expression a silent encouragement to those who labored over their books. The students who studied by lamplight saw in her story a promise that knowledge, when guided by love, could lift humanity higher instead of dividing it further. In a world that had begun to worship intellect without morality, Catherine's life remained a gentle correction. She had been the most brilliant of her generation, yet she had bent her intellect before faith and called it wisdom. That gesture of humility became her enduring lesson to the centuries that followed. In the East, the monastery that bore her name continued to guard its sacred peace. The monks of Sinai, cloistered within walls that had withstood invasions, earthquakes, and the passing of empires, kept alive the unbroken rhythm of prayer. Their chants still echoed through the desert valleys, rising with the same measured cadence that had marked the earliest centuries of Christianity. Pilgrims who arrived after days of journeying through wind and sand found in that place something that the modern world had forgotten: the silence in which God can be heard. They entered through gates weathered by 1,000 years and stepped into a courtyard fragrant with olive trees and incense. Within the chapel, where lamps burned before ancient icons, they felt the weight of time dissolve. The story of Catherine was not history there. It was presence. She was not a figure of the past, but a companion of the moment. The monks told how the oil in their lamps, said to be drawn from the same relics that had touched her body, never failed to burn. In the stillness, the pilgrims prayed, and many left with the unshakable conviction that holiness endures because it does not belong to time at all. Meanwhile, in the great cities of the West, where towers replaced steeples and screens replaced candles, her image quietly persisted. It survived in the mosaics that glimmered above altars, in the paintings that hung half-forgotten in museums, in the stained glass that still caught the morning sun even when the churches stood nearly empty. Her wheel, her palm, her crown, They lingered like fragments of a forgotten language, waiting to be understood again. And sometimes, without knowing her name, people paused before those images and felt a stillness they could not explain. Something in her gaze, tender and resolute, seemed to speak directly to their unrest. It said, "You were made for more than fear." It said, "You were created to love what is true." In that brief silence between heartbeats, something ancient stirred. The same yearning that had once led Catherine from philosophy to faith, from knowledge to surrender. Her influence can still be felt in the places where thought and faith meet. In universities and seminaries that still bear her name, young men and women study theology, philosophy, and science, seeking to understand the mysteries of creation. They gather each year on her feast to celebrate not only her martyrdom, but her mind, the clarity with which she saw that every truth, however small, reflects the one truth that is God. Professors speak of her as the saint who unites reason and revelation, the one who proved that inquiry, rightly pursued, leads not away from God but toward Him. Her story becomes a compass for those who fear that faith and intellect cannot coexist, reminding them that in Catherine they are one and the same. And yet, her deepest message belongs not to scholars, but to every soul that has ever felt small beneath the weight of the world. For Catherine's greatness lay not in what she knew, but in how she loved. She never sought to be remembered. She sought only to be faithful. Her victory was not the conversion of philosophers, nor the miracle that broke her wheel, but the quiet surrender that allowed grace to make her whole. She remains, above all, a witness to the beauty of constancy, to the peace that comes when one's heart no longer wavers between truth and fear. When the last light of day fades over the Sinai mountains and the monastery bells begin their slow and solemn song, her story continues. The wind moves through the narrow valleys, carrying with it the prayers of countless generations who have spoken her name. Somewhere in that timeless silence, the young scholar of Alexandria still walks, her lamp unquenched, her spirit luminous as ever. And if one listens long enough, it is easy to believe that her voice can still be heard, soft as the turning of a page, steady as the beating of a heart, saying to all who seek, "There is no darkness the light cannot overcome, no empire that can silence truth, no death that can extinguish love." There are few stories that travel as far through time as the one that belongs to Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Her memory has crossed languages, continents, and centuries like a river that never runs dry, reshaping the landscape of every soul that encounters it. In her, humanity sees its own reflection, brilliant yet fragile, proud yet longing, capable of great understanding yet forever reaching toward something it cannot quite grasp. Perhaps that is why her legend never disappears, even when other names are forgotten. She speaks to that deepest part of the human heart that hungers for meaning greater than success, for truth that will not fade, for a love that stands when all else falls away. Her story does not only belong to the Church or to history, it belongs to every soul that has ever stood before the mystery of existence and dared to ask why it was born to seek at all. By the 20th century, the world seemed to have moved far from saints and miracles. The age of engines, cities, and wars had left little room for reverence, and yet, amid that restless noise, Catherine's presence endured in the quiet corners of faith. In small village churches where the candles burned low, her feast was still kept each November. Farmers would lay their tools aside, teachers would bring their students to the chapel, and old women would whisper the same prayers their grandmothers had once taught them. Saint Catherine, pure and wise, keep our hearts steadfast in truth. For some, the prayer was habit, a fragment of tradition. For others, it was a plea for strength in a century that seemed to have lost its soul. Her story carried into these modern years the same light that had guided generations before, a soft and steady radiance that refused to be dimmed by the shadow of progress. The world, meanwhile, grew hungry again for meaning. The devastation of wars, the disillusionment of ideologies, the loneliness of modern life, all these drew humanity back to questions it thought it had outgrown. And in that returning hunger, Catherine's life once more found its place. Her example of courage without hatred, intellect without arrogance, and faith without fanaticism began to speak again to those who sought balance in a world of extremes. The philosophers who read her story did not all share her faith, but they recognized in her something they could not dismiss: the rare integration of thought and love. The Church, too, found in her a symbol of what it means to witness truth in a fractured world. She became, in this new age, not a relic of the past, but a model for renewal. For Catherine had never fled the world's complexity. She had entered it fully, and there, in its heart, she had allowed grace to triumph. Her story was told again and again, each retelling shaped by the needs of its listeners. In the ruins of Europe after the Second World War, preachers spoke of her as the saint who reminded humanity that conscience cannot be silenced, that every empire built on falsehood will one day collapse beneath the weight of its own injustice. In countries emerging from oppression, she became a patron of truth-tellers and the brave. In schools run by religious sisters, she remained the gentle guardian of learning, her image often painted above chalkboards, her wheel subtly carved into the wooden frames of desks, a quiet invitation for students to study not merely for achievement, but for wisdom. Even in places where faith had been driven underground, her name circulated in whispers, reminding believers that faith need not be loud to be unshakable. Pilgrimages to her monastery at Mount Sinai continued, even as the world modernized around it. Planes replaced caravans, but the journey's spirit remained unchanged. Travelers arrived weary from cities of steel and light, and as they stepped into the desert's vast silence, something within them began to slow. The sky stretched wider than they had imagined. The mountains glowed red with dawn, and all the busyness they carried seemed to dissolve into the stillness. The monastery itself stood like an ark of stone, guarding not only her relics, but the memory of a world that still believed in mystery. The monks, robed in the same brown garments worn for centuries, greeted pilgrims with smiles that needed no words. They led them to the chapel, where Catherine's body was said to rest, and there, before the gold-covered altar, visitors often wept. They did not all understand why. Some had come without belief, others without expectation. But the silence spoke to them, the same silence that once surrounded the burning bush where God told Moses, "Take off your shoes, for this is holy ground." In that place, Catherine's story was no longer legend. It was living presence, the evidence of a love that outlasts all ruin. Artists of the modern world, too, found themselves drawn to her. Poets compared her intellect to the clear flame of a candle that burns without consuming. Painters reimagined her face, not as the distant saint of marble altars, but as a young woman of the earth. Dark-eyed, contemplative, caught between tenderness and resolve. Musicians composed hymns in her honor, blending ancient chant with modern harmony, their melodies rising and falling like prayer itself. Even filmmakers and novelists, though rarely devout, found in her story a drama that transcended religion. A woman of youth and genius, standing alone before tyranny, armed only with conviction. They could not resist the beauty of that image, the paradox of fragility becoming strength, of reason sanctified by love. Within the Church, her message continued to grow in relevance. The Second Vatican Council, which sought to renew the dialogue between faith and the modern world, echoed the same spirit that had animated her life. The call for unity between faith and intellect, the insistence that reason and revelation are not enemies, but partners in truth. These were the very ideals Catherine had embodied in her brief and shining years. Theologians wrote of her as a symbol of the Church's own vocation: to speak truth in love, to witness with both heart and mind, to resist not through force, but through fidelity. Her name was invoked at gatherings of Catholic educators, philosophers, and women of faith who saw in her a forerunner of their own callings. She was no longer only the saint of scholars, but the saint of dialogue, between the sacred and the secular, between the human and the divine. And beyond all the theology and art, her story continued to work its quiet miracles. In hospitals, a nurse whispered her name before entering a room of suffering. In a classroom, a teacher placed her image upon the desk before an exam, praying for patience and understanding. In the solitude of a library, a student struggling with doubt found in her story the courage to believe that faith need not fear the mind. Even in moments unseen by the world, Catherine's intercession still lived, like a soft wind stirring the heart toward truth. Her legend did not need the grandeur of history. It needed only a single soul willing to listen. When night falls upon the desert of Sinai and the stars bloom one by one across the velvet sky, the monks still light their lamps before her relics. The prayers they chant are the same prayers whispered by mothers in cities and by students before their books. The same melody carries through time. Holy Catherine, pray for us. Teach us to see wisdom as love and love as truth, and perhaps it is in those words that her entire life is contained. The girl who sought knowledge, the woman who found grace, the martyr who found joy in surrender. Her light endures because it belongs not to one age, but to all. For even now, in a century of iron and glass, Catherine of Alexandria remains what she has always been, the soul who proves that no empire, no philosophy, no despair can defeat a mind illuminated by love. And as long as human hearts keep searching for what lies beyond power and pride, her wheel will continue to turn, silently, eternally, carrying her story into the ages that are yet to come. The desert around Mount Sinai has not changed. When dawn arrives, the sky still opens like a page of gold, and the mountains rise from the horizon in solemn stillness, as if eternity itself has come to rest upon them. The same wind that once carried the voices of the prophets now carries the prayers of monks and pilgrims who gather in the shadow of St. Catherine's monastery. There, among the rough stones and the scent of olive oil, her memory is as alive as the morning light. The bells still sound at sunrise, soft and slow, calling the living to remember the dead, not with mourning, but with reverence. And beneath those ancient walls, her presence lingers like a breath held between heaven and earth. She who once stood in the marble courts of Alexandria now reigns not with power, but with peace. The silence that surrounds her resting place is not the absence of sound, but the fullness of meaning, the echo of all she gave and all she became. Through centuries of storms, her monastery has endured as the oldest continually inhabited Christian community in the world. Empires have risen and crumbled around it. Armies have passed through its valleys, leaving no trace but dust. Yet the small lamps within those walls have never gone out. Their light, drawn from the oil of ancient olives, burns as it did when the first monks built their chapel around the relics of the teenage martyr. Within its narrow corridors are icons so old they seem to breathe, their colors softened by centuries of prayer. Among them stands her image, the young woman in a white robe, a wheel at her side, a book in her hands, and a gaze that pierces through time itself. Every pilgrim who enters that chapel feels it, the strange meeting of worlds, where the fragility of the human and the majesty of the divine touch without fear. It is said that when the monks first settled at the base of Sinai, they felt drawn there not merely by her relics, but by her spirit. To them, Catherine was not a figure of the past, but a guardian of their present, a soul who understood solitude, who knew what it meant to seek God in silence. Her monastery became, through her intercession, a bridge between faiths. For Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike have found reverence there. The Prophet Muhammad himself, according to tradition, issued a charter of protection to the monks, ensuring their safety for all time. Thus, the monastery has stood as a living symbol of peace between the children of Abraham, a place where devotion rises from many tongues, but toward one God. Catherine, whose mind had embraced both philosophy and faith, became across the centuries a silent ambassador of unity. Even in a world divided by creed and culture, her light remained unbroken, a harmony beyond argument, a wisdom beyond boundary. As the centuries advanced, the pilgrimage to Sinai became not only a journey of faith, but of reflection. To climb that mountain was to confront one's own frailty and pride, to walk in the steps of prophets and martyrs, to stand beneath a sky so vast that all human pretensions dissolved. Travelers came from every corner of the earth, kings and scholars, hermits and wanderers, the devout and the doubtful. Many wrote of their experiences in journals that still survive. One pilgrim in the 17th century described standing before the relics of St. Catherine and feeling an indescribable peace, as though time itself knelt in prayer. Another spoke of hearing the monks chant the Psalms in Greek and Arabic, their voices weaving together in tones so low and pure that the stones seemed to tremble. All who came left changed. Few could explain it. Perhaps it was not merely the holiness of the place, but the presence of a soul who had once lived as they did, questioning, searching, yearning, and who had found, at last, what every heart seeks: the stillness of truth. In the modern age, the world's attention often returns to Sinai in moments of turmoil, as if remembering the mountain might restore the balance lost in the noise of nations. Journalists, archaeologists, and scientists have come with cameras and instruments, yet even they fall silent in that desert where her bones are said to rest. For technology can measure distance and time, but it cannot measure grace. And in that place, grace remains tangible. The monks who guard her monastery continue their work as their forebears did, rising before dawn to pray, tending to their small gardens, translating ancient manuscripts, and welcoming visitors who come burdened with questions. Many arrive weary, hardened by the speed of life, and leave softened by the simplicity they encounter there. Catherine's story greets them not as history, but as a mirror, showing them what courage looks like when born of love rather than pride. It is remarkable how her presence reaches beyond even faith. Modern thinkers have studied her legend for what it reveals about the human condition. They see in her a portrait of integrity, of intellect fused with virtue, of beauty rooted in conviction rather than vanity. For women across centuries, she remains an icon of dignity, the scholar who did not surrender her voice, the believer who stood firm without hatred. To the oppressed, she is hope. To the learned, she is wisdom. To the faithful, she is intercession. In her life, every human strength was touched by grace and made new. The wheel that once symbolized cruelty has become the emblem of transformation, proof that suffering, when offered in love, becomes the forge of glory. Her influence endures even where belief wanes. In schools, her name is still invoked as patron of students, philosophers, and those who seek understanding. Her feast is celebrated in universities, cathedrals, and humble chapels alike. And though the crowds who once filled the streets with processions have thinned, her light continues to move quietly through the lives of those who listen. A teacher lighting a candle before class, a mother whispering a prayer before her child's exam, a young woman standing up for truth in a world that prefers silence. All these, whether they know it or not, walk in her footsteps. Catherine's story is not merely to be remembered, it is to be lived. There is a tenderness to the thought that her relics rest in the same desert where Moses first heard God's voice. The fire that once burned in the bush without consuming it burns still in her story. A fire of intellect and faith, of courage and compassion, unquenchable across the centuries. And perhaps it was always meant to be so. The mountain that gave the law now guards the saint who lived by love. Between them lies the eternal dialogue of God and humanity, the command and the answer, the truth and the heart that embraces it. In that silence between heaven's word and earth's reply, Catherine stands, radiant and young forever. As night falls upon Sinai, the stars bloom in the sky like 1,000 small candles, and the monks once again begin their chant. The melody drifts through the stone corridors, out into the desert, where the wind carries it across the dunes. Somewhere, perhaps, it reaches the ears of those who still seek what Catherine sought, the peace that comes from surrender, the joy that comes from knowing truth not as an idea, but as a person. Her wheel no longer turns in torment. It turns now in glory, the slow, eternal rhythm of faith meeting eternity. And in that rhythm, the world continues to find its hope. When the sun rises over Mount Sinai, its light falls upon stone that has not changed in 1,000 years, upon walls that have watched both silence and song, upon the monastery that bears the name of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. The dawn begins like a prayer that no one needs to speak aloud. Monks move quietly through the corridors, their sandals brushing against the same stones that countless others have crossed before. They gather in the chapel, the scent of oil and incense filling the air, their chants echoing softly off the walls where Catherine's image glows faintly in gold and red. For them, time has no power. The centuries flow like a single breath, and every morning is the same morning, every prayer the same offering that began the day she was born into eternity. It is in such moments that one feels how thin the boundary is between the living and the departed. Catherine's spirit is not trapped in history. It breathes in this rhythm of devotion, in this gentle insistence that faith is a conversation that never ends. Her presence lingers in the hush that follows the last note of the psalm, in the trembling of the flame that refuses to die even as the dawn's light grows stronger. For those who have devoted their lives to prayer, she is not a saint distant in glory, but a sister who still prays beside them. They feel her not as a memory, but as a living heartbeat within the silence. And outside these walls, where the world turns endlessly upon itself, her life continues to reach across centuries, calling every soul to listen for the voice that once called her. Beyond Sinai, her influence has woven itself into the tapestry of Christian devotion, into art and language, into the gentle customs that shape the faith of generations. In Europe, her feast day still brings the scent of bread baking in kitchens, the sound of church bells cutting through cold November air. old traditions endure. In France, young women place candles before her image and pray for wisdom in love and life. In England, scholars remember her as the patroness of study and clarity of thought. In the East, her icon is carried in solemn procession, the faithful chanting hymns older than their language itself. And though these customs differ, they share one heartbeat, the remembrance of a soul that saw truth not as something to possess, but as something to serve. In the quiet of churches that stand nearly empty now, her statues still wait. They gather dust and candle soot, their marble eyes turned heavenward, their hands resting upon the symbol of the broken wheel. Yet sometimes, when a single visitor kneels before them, lighting one small flame, the meaning of her story is reborn. For holiness does not need crowds. It needs only a heart willing to listen. The woman who once spoke to emperors still speaks to the lonely student, the weary teacher, the believer struggling to reconcile the mind's doubts with the heart's devotion. Her story offers no escape from the world's complexity. It offers peace within it. It reminds us that the human mind, for all its brilliance, finds its fulfillment only when it kneels before love. In our age, when truth itself often feels like a matter of opinion, and the loudest voices drown out the wisest, Catherine's life rises again as a quiet correction. She teaches not through argument, but through example. Her defiance before Emperor Maxentius was not a rebellion of pride. It was fidelity to something greater than power. She did not shout. She reasoned with gentleness. She did not condemn. She invited. And when violence answered her faith, she responded not with hatred, but with peace. It is this harmony of intellect and humility that gives her story its enduring force. In her, faith and reason are not rivals, but companions, walking together towards the same light. That is why even those who live far from belief still find something in her irresistible. The integrity of a soul that refused to divide itself. The beauty of a mind at rest in truth. Writers of the modern world, even those untouched by religion, have found in her a mirror for their own longing. They describe her not as a figure of superstition, but as the saint of seekers, the one who proves that conviction can coexist with curiosity. Philosophers quote her as the embodiment of unity between knowledge and faith. Feminists see in her a rare example of feminine authority that did not depend on rebellion, but on the courage of authenticity. She stood alone in a world that dismissed the intelligence of women, and yet her intellect silenced scholars, her virtue disarmed rulers, and her purity converted nations. She remains a paradox of strength through surrender, a reminder that greatness of spirit needs no armor, but love. Across the globe, her name continues to mark the thresholds of schools, convents, and universities. St. Catherine's colleges in England, in Ireland, in Australia, in Kenya, each one a descendant of her legacy. Beneath their vaulted roofs, young people gather to learn, to debate, to search, perhaps without realizing that their patron once did the same beneath the marble colonnades of Alexandria. Her name still blesses the pursuit of truth, whispering that to study the world is to seek its creator, and that every discovery, however small, can be a hymn of praise. In every place where reason seeks meaning, her light still falls softly, reminding humanity that the mind was never meant to stand apart from the heart. There are moments, too, when her story returns to the center of the Church's heart. Pilgrimages to Sinai have become rare, yet those who still make them speak of a transformation that words cannot contain. The long silence of the desert becomes an echo of her own serenity. The stars above the monastery seem to burn with the same light that once filled her eyes. To stand before her relics, they say, is to stand at the edge of eternity, where the noise of the world finally ceases, and one can almost hear the whisper she spoke to the emperor before her death. There is a truth no power can command, a love no sword can wound. And in that moment, every century folds into one: the empire, the philosophers, the martyrs, and the pilgrims of today, all gathered at the feet of a young woman who proved that faith, once found, transforms everything it touches. Her story has entered the quiet places of memory now, but it has not ended. It flows through each person who chooses conscience over convenience, compassion over control, patience over pride. Every act of courage that refuses hatred, every voice that defends truth with gentleness, every heart that endures suffering with grace, all of these are continuations of the same song she began. For the saints do not die, they change form. Their words become the wind, their lives become the light by which others find their way. And so, as night falls once more over the Sinai desert, the monks return to their prayers. The lamps flicker, the walls glow softly with the reflection of flame. Above them, the stars shimmer in ancient silence, unchanged since the night when Catherine's soul rose among them. The air is cool, the stones still warm from the day's sun. Somewhere in that stillness, a whisper lingers, the same question that began her story and that continues to begin ours. What becomes of a mind so brilliant, so brave, so pure, that it kneels in love before the cross? The answer, now as then, is simple. It becomes eternal. Centuries pass, and the sands of Sinai shift as they always have, covering and uncovering the same ancient stones, but the story of Saint Catherine of Alexandria remains as luminous as ever. It is not a tale that belongs to one time or place, nor even to one people. It is the story of the human soul itself, caught between knowledge and mystery, reason and faith, pride and surrender. Her name, spoken quietly in prayer or read upon the pages of history, still carries a certain hush, the reverence one feels before a truth that no violence could erase. To think of her now, in this age of unending speed and noise, is to remember that the deepest revolutions have never been fought with swords or slogans, but with the strength of the spirit. Her courage was not loud, it was steady. Her victory was not in conquest, it was in constancy. She remains, across the corridors of time, the patron of the questioning heart, the saint who reminds humanity that wisdom and holiness are not opposites, but reflections of the same divine light. When one contemplates her life from beginning to end, it feels less like reading history and more like walking a pilgrimage of the soul. From the child of noble birth, gazing upon the scrolls of philosophers beneath the Alexandrian sun, to the young woman who dared to challenge an emperor, to the martyr who faced death with serenity and forgiveness, her life traces the arc of transformation that every believer must follow. She began as a seeker, hungry for truth. She ended as a witness, consumed by love. The world around her measured greatness by wealth and might, but she measured it by fidelity to conscience. The emperor before whom she stood believed that truth could be dictated by decree, yet she knew it could only be received as grace. When he threatened her with pain, she answered not with defiance, but with faith. There is no fear in love, for perfect love casts out fear. Her words, once spoken in the marble halls of Alexandria, still echo today in the quiet rooms where people face their own trials, the sickness, the sorrow, the small daily martyrdoms that no historian will record. If she could speak to this world now, her message would be no different from the one she gave then. She would remind us that truth is not found in domination, but in dialogue, that reason must learn humility, and that love is never the enemy of understanding. She would say that the modern age, for all its brilliance, suffers from the same blindness as the empire she once defied, that it confuses knowing with wisdom and power with peace. She would tell us to seek silence again, for in silence the soul remembers what the noise has drowned, that life itself is sacred, that creation is ordered by love, that to know is to adore. And she would say, as she did in her youth, that to pursue knowledge without virtue is to chase light into darkness. Her wisdom remains the same because truth doesn't age. It waits patiently in every heart, ready to rise when the world grows weary of its own brilliance. In the great universities that bear her name, her memory endures as a gentle presence. Students hurry across courtyards with books in their hands and questions in their eyes, unaware that their very search echoes hers. They sit in libraries surrounded by the hum of thought, by ideas centuries old and yet still restless, and in that silence between pages, Catherine's spirit lingers. She is there in every mind that struggles honestly toward understanding, in every heart that believes learning can be holy. Professors speak of her as a patron of the intellect, but she is also a patron of wonder, the capacity to be astonished by truth rather than proud of it. For Catherine never sought to own wisdom, she sought to be possessed by it. She did not seek to prove God, but to know Him, and in knowing Him, she found that knowledge itself was transfigured into love. In homes across the world, her image still hangs in modest frames. Sometimes she stands in gold leaf, her hand upon her wheel. Sometimes she is painted in soft tones, her face serene and youthful, a star above her brow. But more than the art itself, it is the atmosphere her image brings, the sense of quiet strength, of light that asks nothing but to be received. Her story is told by grandmothers to grandchildren, by priests in sermons, by teachers before their students. It is told in villages and in cities, in chapels and cathedrals, in whispered bedtime prayers and solemn litanies. Each retelling is a kind of rebirth, as though every generation must discover her anew. And each time, the same realization dawns, that sanctity is not remote. It begins with a question, it grows through perseverance, and it ends in surrender. At Mount Sinai, the monks who keep watch by her relics know this truth more intimately than anyone. To them, the passing centuries are merely the unfolding of the same mystery Catherine once embodied, that God is not far from the human heart. The mountains that surround them stand silent, but their silence is not emptiness. It is listening. Every dawn when the first bell tolls, the desert awakens in prayer. The wind moves through the olive branches like a sigh. The light spills through narrow windows, touches the icons, glows upon the marble floor where generations have knelt. And in that moment, Catherine's presence feels near, not as a figure of marble, but as a breath of living grace. Her bones may rest there, but her soul walks among those who come to seek her. The wheel that once symbolized pain has become the circle of eternity. The sword that once ended her life has become the instrument of her crown. Even outside the walls of faith, her legacy endures. She has entered literature, philosophy, and art as a timeless symbol of conscience and intellect united. Scholars write of her as the embodiment of wisdom sanctified. Humanitarians speak of her as a model of courage grounded in compassion. In a time when knowledge expands faster than understanding, she stands as a reminder that progress without purpose is hollow. Her martyrdom, once an ancient tragedy, has become a modern parable, a story not of loss but of fulfillment, not of defeat but of divine victory. The miracle of the shattered wheel is the miracle of love transforming cruelty into light. If one listens closely, her story continues to move like a quiet river beneath the surface of history. It flows through every act of mercy, every honest question, every prayer whispered in doubt. It flows through the teacher's patience, the student's longing, the believer's endurance. It flows wherever the human spirit lifts its eyes from the dust and remembers that it was made for eternity. And perhaps that is her truest miracle, that her life did not end in death, but in multiplication, her light reflected now in countless others. When the monks finish their prayers at Sinai and the last notes of their chant fade into the desert, night returns. The stars gather over the mountain like a crown. The air is cool and the silence immense. Somewhere in that darkness, her story continues, not as words, but as presence. The mind that once dazzled philosophers, the voice that once silenced emperors, the heart that once embraced the cross, all live now in the eternal dialogue between heaven and earth. And for those who listen, that dialogue has never ceased. Her journey, which began in the pursuit of knowledge, ends in the embrace of love. And so her wheel keeps turning through the ages, carrying her story forward into every soul that still dares to seek, to believe, and to surrender. For St. Catherine of Alexandria is not merely a saint of the past, she is a promise of what humanity can become when wisdom kneels before grace, and when truth is no longer an idea, but a living flame within the heart.